Okay, so how do you diagnose diabetes? Well, there are multiple ways to diagnose this, but all of them require some sort of lab work. The main ways are looking at either a random or fasting glucose level, getting your hemoglobin A1C checked, or performing an oral glucose tolerance test. First, let's talk about fasting and random glucose levels. For a fasting glucose level, it's exactly what it sounds like. For this test, we'd have you check your glucose levels after an overnight fast. And if the lab value is greater than 126 milligrams per deciliter, then that would typically make the diagnosis of diabetes. This is cheap and simple, but it does rely on the fact that the patient doesn't eat at all before the test, because it's definitely possible for someone to have a blood glucose greater than 126 if they just ate something and still not have diabetes. So for a random glucose, this just means that we randomly check your glucose and you don't have to be fasting. So this is commonly seen when we order other labs that include a glucose value, and then you might see an elevated number that would kind of get us worried that the patient might have diabetes. Specifically, if you have a random glucose above 200, then you can technically make the diagnosis, but realistically, you'll probably get some sort of confirmatory lab just to make sure, unless it's just an absurdly high number. We typically use 200 because few metabolically healthy individuals would have a glucose value over 200 even after eating anything, and so it gives us a quick and dirty way to potentially find diabetes in patients who are, we weren't even screening for. Next, let's talk about hemoglobin A1C, which is a test that measures the concentration of glycosylated hemoglobin, or hemoglobin molecules with sugar attached to it, in the bloodstream. Essentially, they just want to see how much sugar is stuck on hemoglobin, which is a component of the red blood cells in your body. A value of 6.5% or greater will give you the diagnosis of diabetes. And the higher the number, the more poorly controlled the diabetes has, and you can infer that there was a higher concentration of sugar throughout the life of that red blood cell, which is about 90 days or so. So essentially what we're looking at for this test is how much sugar sticks to the hemoglobin on the red blood cells during its lifespan of about 90 days. This then also brings up one of the weaknesses of the A1C value, because if the red blood cells are, living longer, then naturally we'll have more sugar stuck on it over its lifespan, leading to an artificially higher A1C. On the other hand, if the red blood cells have a shorter lifespan due to things like anemia, then the A1C will be artificially low because there is not as much time for the glucose to get glycosylated on the hemoglobin. So because of the relationship to the red blood cells, we typically don't repeat this lab any more frequently than about 3 months to allow for the theoretical complete overturn of all the living red blood cells. That kind of gives us a better look at things. However, despite these possibilities and issues, the A1C is probably the most commonly used diabetic test in the office because it's so easy, quick, and cheap. So you can still get some good information from this test, but unfortunately this is only abnormal when you've had years of issues already so that you weren't even aware of it. So it's kind of a bit reactive in nature, but can still give us some good information about a snapshot in time. However, if we're looking for the most informative test, then the oral glucose tolerance test is probably your best option. In this test, you typically fast overnight, and then your fasting glucose is checked in the morning. Next, you drink a super sugary drink with about 75 grams of glucose, and then wait about 2 hours to check your blood sugars again. If the level is greater than 200 at 2 hours, then a diagnosis of diabetes can be made. Now, it's also worth mentioning that this is the test we typically do with pregnant patients, but that test is a little varied, where they'll drink about 100 grams of glucose, and then the labs are drawn at 1 hour, and they come back for a separate test if the initial test was abnormal. So they're both the same concept, just slightly different from each population. This test is probably the most accurate, and we can see how your body actually responds to carbohydrates, which can be really helpful. That being said, this is not ordered that often in most practices because it takes a long time to complete, and most people don't want to just sit in a lab for 2 hours. So it's important to work with your doctor to figure out what test works for you. Thanks so much for joining me today. Now get off the internet, go be active, and enjoy your life. We'll see you next time.